Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Erin Page. I'm the Senior Law Librarian on staff with Fast Case Legal Research, and joining me is my colleague, Morgan. Morgan, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. My name is Morgan Wright, and I'm the publisher at Full Court Press, which publishes the book we'll be discussing today.
Just a couple of quick housekeeping announcements before we get started. The first announcement, you may have noticed that you're currently in listen-only mode. This is to ensure that there's less background noise so everyone can hear our wonderful guest. However, questions are welcome at any point during today's presentation. To ask questions, on your screen you should still have the pop-up from GoToWebinar, and there is a questions box there. We'll monitor that questions box to ensure that everybody can hear and also to answer any questions that you might have. Our second housekeeping announcement. Today's session is not for CLE credit. However, I assure you, you will not be disappointed. Our wonderful speaker has a ton of information for you, so I hope you'll enjoy today's session. And with that, John, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm John Blumberg. And I'm going to be talking to you today about persuasion science. And I'll start with this question. What is one of the most important responsibilities that we have as lawyers? The answer is to present information so that others can make decisions. How have we learned to do this? Mostly from the experience of others and from our own trials and errors, or as I like to think, trials and tribulations. It's not based on how the brain works. It's based on what seems to work for some lawyers in some situations. And when these techniques don't work, what? Blame stupid jurors? Well, it turns out that there is an enormous body of social science research in a field called decision science. Imagine that. A half century of research into the factors that influence how people make decisions. You know who uses some of this research? Salesmen and marketers who apply this science to persuade people that they need to buy something that they hadn't even considered that they wanted or needed. You know who doesn't use this information? Lawyers. There is a lot of proven science that could help lawyers understand how to design a persuasive presentation instead of throwing stuff at the wall and hoping that some of it sticks. Persuasion science for trial lawyers applies these research findings to the practice of law, and it works. I'm going to demonstrate one of the bases of this science by asking you to observe something. Erin, could you please play the demonstration? Okay, thank you. What was that? It has to do with an important part of the science of persuasion. Right now, you might be wondering, why should I devote the next 45 minutes or so listening to this guy? What's in it for me? Well, one thing is that you're going to learn something that will affect the way you approach persuasion for the rest of your career. So let's get started with some questions that you might already be asking yourselves.
Let's start at the very beginning, John. What put you on the path to write this book initially?
In a word, losing. When I knew that the facts of the case that I was trying practically compelled a verdict in my client's favor, and I lost. I'm pretty introspective and thought about all of the things that I might have done wrong. And it would be really easy just to say that the jurors were all stupid and didn't pay attention. I wanted to believe that decisions are the result of logic and common sense and critical thinking. But I thought there must be something else going on. So I started reading about how people make decisions. And I learned that decisions based on so-called common sense was a lot of the time based on the brain's unwillingness to do the hard work of critical thinking. Oh, just use your common sense. Well, that kind of means don't overthink this. Common sense is really a collection of stereotypes and automatic responses that we use in getting through our days so we don't have to overtax our brain. So I learned how emotions can overcome rational thought, and that excessive information might lead to worse decisions, not better decisions. At this point, I thought I might be on to something. So I ended up reading hundreds of peer-reviewed journals in science and sociology and psychology journals. And I was amazed that all of this information was there for the taking, but it just hadn't been translated so that lawyers could understand it and use it. That was how I got on the path to writing this book.
So speaking of the book, the title is Persuasion Science for Trial Lawyers. But is it really only for trial lawyers?
Its focus is to help trial lawyers, but it's really for every lawyer who has to communicate his or her ideas, whether to a client or a committee or a board of directors or a jury. In fact, the first 4 chapters talk about what all lawyers have to deal with in their practices, mainly communicating and understanding and dealing with conflict in our communications with our clients, with opposing counsel, with court personnel, and in the way that we write. In fact, one of the chapters deals specifically with what I call legalese and mumbo jumbo. So the first part of the book talks about the psychology of communication, which is basically pre-trial. And then from chapter 5 on, then we're talking about trial lawyers.
Jumping into the text of the book, and chapter 4 of the book is titled Be the Water, Not the Rock. What exactly does that mean, and what does that have to do with lawyers?
Well, it has to do with the really needless and unproductive conflict during litigation and discovery. It's a complete waste of time, and it's a waste of our clients' money and our money if we're on a contingency fee. So the solution, and this is what that chapter talks about, is flexibility. And let me just read a little bit from chapter 4 on flexibility. A stream chuckles along between its banks. In the middle of the stream stands a large rock, commanding with all of its presence for the waters to stop. But the waters keep churning and flowing along, bouncing, streaming, and flowing over the rock. The water has direction. The water has flexibility. Be the water, not the rock. So that's where we start. And there's a part of this chapter that I'd like to read that shines a light on this subject. And the heading is In the Battle Between the Irresistible Force and the Immovable Object, Nobody Wins. Because we are asked to assert rights and defend interests, we are inescapably involved in the business of conflict. And the nature of conflict is disagreement. The challenge is whether we will manage the conflict or whether the conflict will manage us. The advocate for each side will be expected to employ forceful tactics and clever strategies. But for every lawyer who fancies that he or she is an irresistible force, there's an opposing lawyer who's out to prove that he or she is an immovable object. This immovable object versus irresistible force paradox has been the subject of mythology, philosophy, and comic books. To accomplish what you need, you must think outside the box, change the dynamic, and find a way to get what you need by other means. Flexibility and balance will often overcome an immovable object and be the water, not the rock.
John, one of the things you write about in the book is how to condense a complex subject into three things. And the book is fairly long, it's over 200 pages. So what is it about these three things? What is it about that number that makes it ideal?
You mean condensing it into more than three subjects? Why
Right,
three?
exactly.
Well, it's a combination of, of really solid psychological research that most people can't hold a lot of things in their brains for very long. But way before the psychological research on the subject, it was human experience that developed what's called the rule of threes. And there are examples in the Bible, in music, in plays, in speeches, in sayings. So, for example, think about all the things in threes. There are three biblical patriarchs in the Bible, three wise men. We three kings of Orient are three little pigs, Goldilocks and how many bears? Right, three. We take an oath to do three things: preserve, protect, and defend. We seek life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And then there's my personal favorite by the composer George Gershwin. I got rhythm, I got music, I got my gal. Who could ask for anything more? But seriously, there are academic studies proving that when you pass three things into four things, our brains might not remember. So, three things. That's why three.
So speaking of three things, what are the three main things in your book?
Well, it's not about three things. There's a lot more than three, but three important groups of things. And I'll talk about grouping in a minute, but there's three important groups of things. Number one, cognitive limitations. Number two, information rejection. And number three, belief systems.
And can you explain a little bit more about what you mean by cognitive limitations in your book?
Cognitive limitation. Cognitive meanings what the brain is able to do. So people have limitations on their ability to process new information and remember what they hear. But lawyers keep on talking, completely ignoring the limitations that people have on the amount of information that they can absorb. So one of the things the book discusses is this idea that you can only hold so much information in your head. And I would like to show a demonstration. Again, Aaron, the demonstration, please. Okay. If you think that you have to include every possible fact or argument when you are trying to communicate with your clients or with a jury, most of it isn't going to be remembered. But just like the water that poured into the glass, you never know what's going to remain in the glass or in the brain and what's going to spill out. So you might have a pitcher full of information, but the people that you're talking to have only a drinking glass size to fit it in. You can keep pouring information. It's not going to be effective. It's not going to be remembered. So remember at the beginning, I played the pitcher and the water. Why did I do that? One of the ways to engage the brain is by making it curious. When I showed you the spilling water at the beginning, I didn't tell you what it meant, only that it was important. That created curiosity, and curiosity maintains attention. So cognitive limitation means that the brain has to limit and choose what to pay attention to. Creating curiosity is a way to prime the brain to reserve space so that the curiosity can be satisfied. And if you don't remember anything else from this presentation, I promise you will remember the pitcher and the drinking glass. And just remembering that is going to be the clue that you will always be able to remind yourself too much information. Have to make it easier to understand.
So, will you read a little bit from your book, a little bit more perhaps, about how do we deal with these limitations?
Sure. This is from chapter 5. It's called The Science of Jury Education. And this chapter focuses on education science and how to apply this to what we do when we have a bunch of unwilling listeners, like jurors, who didn't show up for jury duty so that they could do a lot of hard thinking that's required in learning. And so education science is very important to understand as the beginning of how to persuade. There are 3 cognitive elements necessary for learning: to understand, to absorb, and to remember. A failure to understand will prevent the ability to absorb, which in turn will result in a lack of recollection. The plaintiff's burden of proof is not achieved by presentation of facts and concepts. It requires understanding that becomes firmly planted in the juror's memory. In a post-trial discussion, if a juror explains that the other side was more convincing, it may be because your evidence was not effectively learned. And although learning begins with processing information, the capacity to process is far from unlimited. The key to making your evidence and your argument memorable is to present it so that it does not exceed limited capacity. And then the rest of the chapter goes on to describe ways of dealing with that limited capacity and still being able to get your message across.
Let's talk a little bit more about that. What happens when a lawyer has to deliver a lot of information? What are some ways that they can help clients or juries or whatever audience they're talking to understand it all?
One way is called chunking, C-H-U-N-K-I-N-G. Chunking is when you group a lot of things together under one heading. So, for example, if you're going to chunk the facts in your case, the first chunk is, for example, how it started. The second is how it happened. And the third is how it ended. It takes a bunch of information and then it makes it mentally manageable. The same way that we remember a 10-digit phone number, which if we were asked by our doctor during a mental status examination to remember 10 numbers, most of us would fail that. But when we think about telephone numbers, it's in 3 chunks: 562, 555, 1212. You've chunked into 3. Same with our social security number. It's chunked into 3. So it's easy to remember. And so that's one way of doing it.
So is there something in your book that explains one of these techniques that they can use to deliver the message without it being completely lost by the listeners?
Yes, that's in chapter 8. And it has to do with creating and converting creating a story by converting these facts into something that people can listen to as a story. The reason is that the world is really a complex place, and stories have been the way that people learn and remember for thousands of years. And so here's a story that starts off chapter 8. It was the time of gods and goddesses. The goddess Truth walked naked into a village to enlighten the people. But the people shunned and ignored her. Dejected, she wandered into a forest where she met the goddess Story. And she told Story what had happened. "Take my cloak," Story said, "and go back to the village." When the goddess Truth returned to the village, the people welcomed her, listened, and believed her words. The moral? For naked truth to be accepted, it must have the cloak of story. So facts aren't remembered, stories are remembered. And when the brain is focused on a story, it loses the ability to be skeptical and look for reasons to dispute facts. So, for example, if you're watching a movie and you're drawn into the story, you aren't thinking that these are a bunch of overpaid actors reading lines. You are drawn into the story and you suspend all of the reasons to disbelieve what you're hearing. That actually has a very important component when you are doing an opening statement or doing a final argument. Because by creating a story out of facts, the jurors aren't thinking, well, yeah, but I'm not so sure about that, or how come you weren't more careful, or all of the reasons that people automatically are thinking of when you just deliver facts to them. The plaintiff was hit in the crosswalk. The jury's thinking, well, why wasn't she more careful? A story has that effect. So chunking is 1, creating a story is 2.
Let's move on to the second thing that you identified in your book as the big 3, and that's information rejection. What is that exactly?
Well, there's several reasons why information is rejected, including limited capacity, mental fatigue, something called reactance and bias. And these are various reasons why information is rejected. We already talked about mental or cognitive capacity. Mental fatigue is best understood if we think of the brain as a muscle that gets tired. So if you're lifting weights, at some point, your muscles are going to get tired. You're not going to be able to keep lifting. If you think of the brain as a muscle that gets tired, a tired brain is going to resist doing the hard work of learning. Reactance is a word that was developed in the mid 1960s by a psychologist whose name was Jack Brem. And he developed a theory that reactance is what happens when you tell someone what they have to do. The response is like when a doctor hits your knee with a rubber hammer. It's an automatic reaction. And just like your leg reacts by moving, when you tell someone what they have to do, the response is an automatic no. We'll get into that in a minute. Bias. Bias isn't, oh, I don't like people of this color, this religion, this nationality. Bias is actually the way each individual understands how the world works. And that bias colors everything that they hear. So that is the basis of the second part of the book, and that is, why is information rejected?
So tell us more about this from the book on why information is rejected.
Well, this is in chapter 10, which is called Resistance to and Rejection of Advocacy. There are powerful psychological barriers that protect everyone, including jurors, from being overwhelmed by new information. Components of these barriers might be described as a belief system or a worldview in which people can make sense of their environment. To maintain the comfort of this status quo, the brain is skeptical. And this skepticism favors the defense because it can prevent juries from being persuaded by lawyers representing plaintiffs who are asking that the status quo be changed. The brain's resistance to persuasion cannot be overcome by overwhelming evidence or eloquent oration. When a person's belief is challenged with solid evidence to the contrary, the belief often becomes stronger. When people are told what they should believe, many reject the message and strongly consider the opposite. Each of these phenomena occurs in part because of how the brain works. And when the subject matter is complex, it is frequently rejected in favor of simpler explanations. Many political candidates are successful because they recognize that simple solutions and appeals to core beliefs often overcome logical explanations of how complex things really are. Every juror's brain is wired to resist persuasion and reject some of what they hear.
Thanks, John. Before we move on to the next question, as a reminder to the audience, we're a little bit more than halfway through the program. If you have any questions for John, feel free to type those into chat and we will address them at the end of the program. So moving on to the third prong of your three big takeaways, that third prong is belief systems. What does that have to do with the science of persuasion?
A belief system is an ideology or a set of principles that helps us to interpret our everyday reality. This could be in the form of religion, political affiliation, philosophy, even the way we were raised. For example, is a stranger to be feared or welcomed? It might depend entirely on your belief system. People look for what confirms what they already believe. And so it is in the context of a belief system that you look for what is called, and what the psychologists call, confirmation bias. We look for that which confirms what we already believe and reject that which is inconsistent with this belief system. And I spend about 4 chapters on setting up what belief systems are and how an advocate can still persuade, even if someone's belief system might say, I'm not in favor of that.
So can you give us an example from your book on why information is rejected?
Well, if we talk about chapter 12, it's not so much why information is rejected as it is how do you deal with rejection based on someone's belief systems. So human beings aren't rational animals. We are rationalizing animals who want to appear reasonable to ourselves. Psychologists use the term confirmation bias to describe how people search for that which is consistent with what they want to believe and ignore that which is inconsistent. It is important for trial lawyers to understand this because it explains why strong evidence is rejected when it conflicts with a contrary belief. And so this is where we get into the beginning of our understanding of how to frame what we are saying so that it is consistent with what people who might not necessarily think the way we do see the world. And so part of what we write about is what I call, and this comes from my favorite program on TV when I was a kid, The Adventures of Superman. What did Superman stand for? Truth, justice, and the American way. If everyone believes in truth, justice, and the American way as a good thing, then we frame our argument so that it is consistent with a search for truth, justice, and what we used to believe was the American way. This has been modified a little bit, but I spend a whole part of a chapter talking about framing so that it is consistent with what the vast majority are going to believe is true. So that's the beginning of it. Then it gets into, well, it gets into something that is really important now, and that is belief polarization. I'll leave that hanging out there for a minute.
So, nice lead in. Does belief system, would you say, include one's political orientation? You know, liberal, moderate, conservative?
That question opens up, I think, is the most interesting part of my book, and that is the evolutionary basis of how we survived as a species, and whether the balance of those survival instincts might make some people liberals or conservatives. In other words, are people's brains hardwired to believe or disbelieve what they are told? So let me just read something from chapter 14, which is called Finding Shared Values of Liberals and Conservatives. And the subheading of this part of the chapter is called Liberals and Conservatives Experience the World Differently. The well-known senses of sight, touch, hearing, and smell, and taste allow everyone to experience the world. The stimuli are identical, but experienced differently from person to person. This is due to differences in individual processing. In other words, everyone has filters that are due in large part to evolution. The earliest humans lived in an environment where they faced daily threats to their existence: wild animals, natural disasters, hostile neighboring tribes, injury, infection, and death. They constantly faced premature death or destruction. Fear of and protection from negative consequences became a valuable trait that likely allowed their survival as a species and our existence today. Numerous studies have resulted in a theory that the fear of negative consequences created a negativity bias that affects everyone differently. For example, in a crisis, some see only danger, but others see opportunity. Therefore, the degree to which one's filter is focused on fear and negativity creates the liberal versus conservative belief system and worldview. Conservative and liberal values and concerns are a spectrum, with moderates in the middle and extremists on the ends. So if we think about why we are here as a species, our distant ancestors had to be wary. They had to be anxious. They had to be paranoid. Should I be concerned with what seems to be a rustling in the bushes? Nah, it's probably just the wind. Well, people who thought like that got eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. Instead of having lunch that day, they were lunch that day. Do you know who the survivors and the descendants are of those people? There aren't any. They didn't survive. Those who survived and who have the descendants, us, are the ones that, when they saw someone coming in from a neighboring tribe, they were wary. When they heard rustling in the bushes, they assumed the worst. If they saw a snake, they didn't say, well, it's probably harmless. When they saw something that was a plant, they didn't say, oh, I think I'll eat that, because they didn't know whether it would poison them. So this negativity bias or an inclination toward negativity is how we got here today. But that negativity resides in all of us to one degree or another. The scientific studies that form part of the basis of my book deal with this negativity and how it creates someone who is more conservative, not necessarily politically, but maybe in the way they see the world, versus someone who is liberal, versus someone who may be moderate. Everyone is a balance of characteristics. A little crazy, I say, a little depressed, a little anxious, a little wary. And all of these things make up the balance of who everyone is. When 12 people are in the jury box, they are a mixture. Each one is a mixture of positivity and negativity and maybe some mixture of both, the moderate, willing to consider both sides. How in the world do you reach people who may have a liberal bent or a conservative bent? When, let's say, you are a liberal and what you are advocating makes absolute positive sense to you, it doesn't mean that it's going to make sense to someone who sees the world differently. How do you know who that person is or who those people are? How do you reach them? You reach them by understanding how to create attention, curiosity, how to assist people in absorbing information and framing in a way that is accepted based on how people see the world. So, an example I like to talk about is I want you to imagine a semicircle. You're thinking about the semicircle right now. Now, answer this question. Is it concave or convex? The answer is, it depends on where you're standing. On one side, it's concave. On the other side, it's convex. The shape is the same, but how you view it depends on where you're standing. And if it's a fact, then how you interpret the fact depends on your point of view. So one of the most important parts of the book is how to understand how the science of persuasion, how decision science can help you get your message across so that whether someone is standing on one side or on the other side, they will be able to be persuaded.
Well, goodness, you have painted such a landscape of all the reasons why people won't listen, understand, or remember what we are telling them. So why isn't this hopeless? In other words, how do you get persuasion to be intentional instead of just random?
Well, what you're asking is persuasion like flipping a coin? You'll probably win half the time, or just a shot in the dark, or throwing stuff up against the wall. It's not hopeless. It's not random, but we have to approach advocacy with the understanding of how people learn and process information. We need to realize that not all jurors have our values or think the way we do. So we have to frame our case so that our facts are receptive to people with widely different beliefs. And we frame it in a way that it is acceptable according to one's viewpoint, and in a way that allows jurors to come to a conclusion without us telling them what to think. When you tell a juror or a jury the evidence compels only one result, that is what I was talking about earlier. It's going to trigger reactance. You're telling the jury what to think. Don't do that. So let me just close with a story. And this had to do with, I had been asked to do a mock trial by another lawyer and to represent the plaintiff's side. And so during the mock trial, I was at the end of the presentation where I was going over the verdict form. And there was a young woman sitting in the front row who I thought was rather taken either by me or by my advocacy. And I went through the jury form saying, this is how the jury form should be answered. I was really interested in observing her on a closed circuit video during deliberations. And so I was watching very carefully this young woman. And she said, and I quote, "Can you believe that douchebag plaintiff lawyer who told us what we had to do?" I was really shocked at that, but it was a lesson, and it was an important lesson. And that lesson is one of the ways to avoid what the brain does when it is confronted in a certain way. When you tell someone what they have to do, you are not being persuasive. So that was an experience of mine, but it turns out that when I was doing the research, there's science behind why that is. And so once you understand the science of persuasion, you can start practicing what we know is the art of persuasion. And that's what the book is about.
Well, John, I want to thank you so much for your time today. And if you've enjoyed this program, it will be available as a recording on our YouTube channel, which is public. All you have to do is search Fast Case to see that. You'll also receive a follow-up email for attending this program, which will include a link where you can purchase John's book. It's available in a number of formats, paperback, Amazon Kindle, EPUB, and also an audiobook, which is read by John himself, who has quite the voice, having formerly been a radio host. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our support team, which is support@fastcase.com. And we want to thank everyone so much for attending. It's been a lot of fun.
Yes, and do keep an eye out. We will have future presentations. And I too would like to thank John for an excellent, excellent presentation. And I highly encourage everyone. The link is going to be sent as part of the email. Check out the book. It is an awesome read.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate your attending this and hearing me talk about the book.